Hello and welcome, everyone. My name is Linda Caprera. I'm with the Maine State Chamber of Commerce. Welcome to our webinar series 4, Challenges for Manufacturing on International Trade and Energy. We've got a full agenda today. We've got 3 experts that are joining us. And first, I'd like to do a little bit of housekeeping issues. Participants are on mute. If you have questions, please use the chat function at the bottom of the screen. But I would like to thank, first and foremost, our premier sponsor, Pretty Flaherty. I would also like to thank our series sponsors, Central Maine Power Company and Bangor Savings Bank and the Department of Economic and Community Development. With that, I'd like to introduce kind of what we're going to be talking about today. There's a lot, as you know, going on in the global economy in terms of this COVID-19 and the pandemic. And I think businesses want to know how this impacts the economy in terms of international trade and energy issues. I'm sure a lot of businesses have questions. They're doing business overseas in different countries. And with the drop in oil prices, how does this impact here, both on the national level and here at home? So with that, I'd like to introduce a few of our guest speakers. First, we have John Murphy. I'll introduce all of them at once, and then I will call them up one by one. John Murphy he is the Senior Vice President for International Policy at the U.S. Chamber. John directs the U.S. Chamber's advocacy relating to international trade and investment policy. Since joining the Chamber in 1999, John has successfully led campaigns to win congressional passage of trade agreements with a dozen nations, including Colombia, Panama, and South Korea in 2011, as well as Trade Promotion Authority in 2015. John also plays a key role in the Chamber's advocacy for international business priorities before Congress, the administration, foreign governments, and the World Trade Organization. In the early 90s, prior to his career at the Chamber, John worked at the International Republican Institute, a nonprofit organization dedicated to the promotion of democracy overseas, and at the Center for International Private Enterprise, which champions market-oriented economic reform around the world. We also have Christopher Guith. He is the Senior Vice President at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce's Global Energy Institute. He is responsible for developing the Institute's policies and initiatives as they apply to the legislative, executive, and regulatory branches of the federal and state governments. Specifically, he focuses on the development of the Energy Institute's policies and messaging relating to oil and natural gas, generation, and nuclear energy. He led the Chamber's Shale Works for U.S. campaign, which analyzed and promoted the widespread benefits of shale energy development in America. In addition, prior to joining the Chamber in 2008, Guth served as the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Nuclear Energy at the U.S. Department of Energy, where he developed the administration's nuclear energy policies and coordinated the department's interactions with Congress, stakeholders, and the media. And finally, we have Tony Buxton, who is the partner at Pretty Flaherty. Tony serves as the chair of the firm's Energy and Utilities Practice Group and as a member of the firm's Management Committee. Tony creates solutions to business energy problems, including the challenge of higher energy costs. He has been a key player in Maine and New England on energy and infrastructure issues for decades, playing an important role in every major piece of energy legislation in Maine in the last 30 years, as well as being involved in the formation of ISO New England. In recent years, Tony has focused on overcoming challenges to infrastructure development in New England, both fixed and network in nature. Prior to joining Pretty Flaherty, Tony served as the first lieutenant in the U.S. Army. Thank you for your service. And worked for future U.S. Senate Majority Leader George Mitchell. After law school, he co-founded the Energy Law Institute in Concord, New Hampshire, the nation's first renewable energy think tank. Welcome, gentlemen. And
thank you.
Thank you very much for coming. We will start with John Murphy from the U.S. Chamber.
Linda, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here with all of you from the Maine State Chamber. We at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce really appreciate the partnership that we have with you all on many different issues. So I'm a trade guy, and trade is one of the areas where, candidly, there's quite a lot of trouble at the moment with the pandemic, with the related economic downturn. The World Trade Organization predicts that there will be something on the order of a 1/3 contraction in world trade this year. That's a pretty nasty number. Here we've seen, in terms of travel, a 95% decline in domestic air travel, and similarly internationally. Air cargo rates have soared, which is somewhat contradictory, but a lot of air cargo goes in the belly of passenger planes, and without that, the limited stock of air cargo flights has led to doubling of air cargo rates on many routes around the world. So there's just a lot of different ways to look at it, and you see a number of challenges. What I'd like to do, though, is dig into this. A lot of these challenges come from just the unprecedented demand destruction, the broad slowdown in the economy because of the lockdown orders that have been necessitated by the pandemic. But in some cases, there's also some bad policy decisions that are, in some countries, driving some of this. So I'm going to talk about 6 different issues here. First of all, trade in medical supplies. I think we've all heard a bit about this. Our medical professionals have suffered from a shortage of PPE, an acronym that I had never heard of before. That's personal protective equipment, the masks, and a variety of other things that medical professionals wear. But it turns out that a lot of this stuff is necessary in manufacturing, as many of you know as well, in agri-food industries, in pharmaceutical manufacturing, and a whole lot of different settings. Many countries have imposed limits on the export of PPE and other medical supplies. The United States had mostly avoided doing that, but then a few weeks ago did issue a limited export ban. They later softened it a bit to allow exceptions for transfers to Canada, Mexico, and also within essential industries where often you're seeing small quantities move back and forth, not the huge volumes that are necessary for the health sector. You know, these shortages, though, I do have a comment about them in that there's a sense that some people say that the problem is because a lot of the production, the manufacturing was offshored to China. In many cases, that's not true. If you look at 3M, for instance, 3M, which makes the Rolls-Royce of masks, of respirators, the N95 that we've all read about. But 3M, for instance, has always made all of their N95s here in the United States by Americans for Americans. The problem is never that production went offshore. The problem is that when you have a pandemic like this, demand surges, and it's up roughly 40 or 50-fold this year. And a company like 3M can double or triple production, but when demand is up the way it is, from 25 million masks last year to something like 500 million this year, nobody can keep up with that. You have to plan for it in advance, and unfortunately, we didn't do that sufficiently as a country. One thing that the Chamber we're working at on these issues is getting more of this material, this PPE from China, which is a major manufacturer in its own right of these materials. And China, after some complaints from around the world about shoddy product in recent weeks, they implemented new regulations to crack down on that. But in the view of many people here in the United States, they cracked down too hard. Many members of Congress weighed in on this. We do seem to be seeing a greater flow of PPE coming in from Asia now, and hopefully we'll be able to assuage some of those shortages that we've had. Turning to a second topic, just more broadly than medical supplies, but looking at China and the trade relationship between our two countries. It's very much front and center in Washington. There's a highly charged political atmosphere about China. I think as our electoral campaign proceeds, we're going to be hearing a lot about China as well. And there's really, I think, to boil it down, there's two sides to this conundrum right now. On the one hand, I think it's widely recognized in the United States, including by the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, that China has engaged in a host of problematic industrial policies, theft of intellectual property, huge subsidies to specific industries. And these policies, these industrial policies, have in many ways harmed U.S. industries. Now, the U.S. response was to impose these so-called Section 301 tariffs in response. They were imposed over the past nearly 2 years by the Trump administration, and most of them are still in place. In fact, almost none of them went away with the China Phase 1 deal announced in January. About $400 billion of imports from China today are subject to those tariffs still. And those, of course, are a tax. Tariffs are a tax. They're paid by the importer. They're paid by Americans. About half of these imports are imports made by U.S. manufacturers who are bringing in parts, components, materials for their own manufacturing. And those tariffs did have a real cost before the pandemic hit. And last year, in 2019, manufacturing entered into a shallow recession. The manufacturing economy of the United States contracted by 1.3%. We heard about the pain that imposed on many manufacturers. We look back at it now at the current economic contraction, and it seems rather mild by comparison. Still, the China Phase 1 deal that was signed in January is in force. It made some fairly modest changes to those Chinese practices I mentioned. China has new IP practices and so on. But one component that we're not seeing is that China committed to make large purchases of U.S. manufactured agricultural products as well. Because of the pandemic, in part, we're not really seeing those materialize yet. There's also major energy purchases, LNG and oil and so on. And that's becoming increasingly polemical. But the trade relationship with China is not going to get any easier in the weeks ahead. And as I mentioned, it's likely to be front and center in this very political year. A third topic, trade challenges here in North America. Here in the United States, I think many of you are familiar with the way that stay-at-home orders were implemented in Maine and other states. There was guidance from the Department of Homeland Security's CISA agency that laid out what are essential industries and what are not. And while none of these approaches were perfect, I think compared to other countries, the United States has been fairly flexible about this. That wasn't true in Mexico, and that's been a big issue. Mexico has become the largest trading partner of the United States, and particularly for American manufacturers, there are many parts and components that go back and forth across the US-Mexico border. And Mexico's approach to its own stay-at-home order was very onerous. It was very heavy-handed, and it did not reach down into supply chains. So for instance, Mexico, after some time, has agreed that the auto manufacturing sector is an essential industry, but suppliers to auto manufacturers were not deemed to be essential, and so they were shut. So of course, the OEMs and their assembly plants, unable to get parts, have had to close down. This has been an issue for many different manufacturing sectors, not just the automotive one. The Chamber has carried out a survey, which is still open, even though we've delivered the results, but we continue to gather input from literally hundreds of companies, how they've been hurt by this. And we've been trying to press the Mexican government to adopt a more flexible approach to this. The administration has been an active partner with us on this. Secretary Pompeo, certainly the U.S. Embassy in Mexico, DHS, all weighing in, but to date we have yet to get much satisfaction there, and it is a problem for many manufacturers. We continue to engage on that though, and we're hoping that in the next couple of weeks we'll be able to see some progress. On a related note there, here in the North American front, I should mention the USMCA, the new NAFTA trade agreement that was approved by the Senate early this year and the House in December, is now set to enter into force on July 1st. This is the conclusion of a 3-year process of negotiation and congressional consideration. There are some ongoing uncertainties about this, though. For some sectors in manufacturing, the new rules of origin of the USMCA are going to impose new regulations that have to be followed. It's particularly strong in the auto sector, but in other areas as well, it's going to be an issue. And Um, Industry is pressing the administration to show flexibility. We're hopeful that there will be a period of what Customs and Border Protection calls informed compliance, during which companies that are not quite complying with these new rules, which in some cases haven't even been issued yet, will nonetheless not be punished for it for a period of time, which hopefully will last, at least 6 months. These rules are intricate. It's going to take time for manufacturers to figure out how to comply with them, and doing so in the middle of a pandemic is not particularly easy. I am reassured, though, by things I've heard from Customs and Border Protection about how they'll do that. One last topic I'll mention is tariffs. The tariffs I talked about earlier, at a time when so many manufacturers and businesses are hurting and having a hard time with liquidity, the Trump administration took a step after much pressure from the private sector to allow importers to defer tariff payments. However, the way they did this was pretty difficult to use. Only certain tariffs, known as MFN, Most Favored Nation tariffs, are included. So the new tariffs, the Section 301 tariffs on imports from China and other tariffs, are not included in this. And importers that had multiple classes of tariffs on top of one another found that it was impossible to distinguish between them, and they were unable to find any of this relief. We're currently pressing for this suspension to be extended for another couple of months. It is just a suspension. It's not a tariff holiday, but it would be really helpful to lots of companies to be able to have that flexibility right now. I'll stop there. There's a number of other issues. There's going to be ongoing efforts in Congress and the administration to quote unquote reshore manufacture, particularly of medical supplies and pharmaceuticals. There is a lot of concern in industry about this, though, because many of those who are writing this legislation are doing so from a fact base that isn't particularly well informed. It turns out that China, for instance, is the source of less than 1% of all the pharmaceuticals made in the United States, whereas you often hear the line that 80% is coming from China. There's no basis in fact for that, however. So what we're doing in Washington right now is trying to make sure that policymakers understand the realities of how supply chains work before trying to legislate from a fact base that's incorrect. So I'll stop there. I look forward to the discussion.
Okay, thank you, John. Next, we have Christopher Guith. Christopher? You're muted.
No. Thank you, Linda. And I can't echo what John said enough, that our partners in the Federation, the state and local chamber, make us infinitely more successful in DC by being able to bring the voices from places like Maine to Congress, which is where business is. It's around the country. So thank you. I'm going to do a little bit of song and dance about oil markets, talk a little bit about electricity and what's happening across the country, and then kind of end with the federal outlook as far as different policies that are likely to be considered over the next, we'll say, 6 to 9 months. I'll start with oil only because it's front and center on every newscast and every newspaper. The U.S. has benefited from becoming the largest oil producer in the world 2 years ago, and then last year, even more so, became a net exporter of oil for the first time since 1945. That helped us in many ways insulate our economy and make us much more competitive than we had been before. And it brought a lot of geopolitical strength to the U.S. government and enabling it to accomplish things around the world that we wouldn't have had the leverage to do before. But when you see something unprecedented happen like the last 2 months, where we've seen global demand decrease by minimum 30%, probably a little bit more. When you're the largest oil producer in the world, it hurts. And even if you're not in Texas or Oklahoma, traditional producing states, even a state like Maine has ties to the supply chain that go into the oil and gas sector. And moreover, oil and gas has become somewhere approaching 3 or 4% of US GDP. So when the oil and gas sector gets hit hard, it affects us all, even if we're, like I said, not in Texas. I mean, this all started in March, long before most Americans even could spell Corona. And you had the Saudis and the Russians get into a little bit of an international tiff, and they decided to cease cooperating. OPEC had invited Russia, and for the last 3 years they had participated together. And Russia said, no, we're not going to decrease our production. OPEC had seen global demand go down, starting in China, and the Russians said, we're not going to do that. So the Saudis said, fine, if you're not going to do that, we're going to flood the market. And so they increased their production by about 30%, and they deeply discounted the price of oil. And this was coming into effect just as Europe and then North America started shutting down its economies. So you had gasoline onto fire. And what we saw over the course of about 4 or 5 weeks is overall demand dropped by, like I said, 30%. And we saw production increase. So you had supply and demand way out of whack. We saw prices go from $65 a barrel, which are sort of historical averages, down to, on average now, $15 a barrel. And then I think everyone probably saw, even people who don't follow markets, that a week ago we saw oil go negative, which is to say people selling oil in futures markets actually had to pay buyers to take the oil away from them. And that's a pretty good deal. I mean, if you can walk into a store and the store owner is going to pay you to walk away with goods, that's nice. The problem is that it's really difficult to kind of turn off the proverbial spigots. And so we saw production continuing to increase, even though demand was going down. And so we saw a massive surplus every single day. Well, if no one's using that and it's coming out of the ground and it has to go somewhere, so it gets stored. And storage was quickly running out. And frankly, it still is, but the rate of overproduction has decreased. And so on that fateful day last week, you had people with physical possession of oil and nowhere to put it. So they had no choice but to pay somebody who could sort of squirrel it away in a tank here or in a ship there. Prices have started to stabilize a little bit, but I wouldn't hold my breath that we're not going to see them decline again. A lot of the prices you see when they say the price of oil, I mean, those are futures contracts. Those are speculation about what supply and demand is going to look like in the future, whether it's a month from now or whether 6 months from now. I think it's important to note that the break-even price for producers in this country, it varies quite a bit, but it's certainly a lot higher than $23 a barrel, which is what we're seeing now. And while as the economy begins to recover, both in the United States and around the world, we will see demand increase and we'll see more consumption. It's going to be relatively slow. I mean, I don't think anyone in the airline industry, which is roughly 30% of all oil sold, expects to see the same rate of travel or the same rate of flights that they had back in December anytime in the next couple of years. What that means for the U.S. oil patch is that we're likely to see dozens and dozens of bankruptcies. We're going to see hundreds of thousands of layoffs. They've already slowly started, but because of some of the provisions in the CARES Act that Congress passed, a lot of that was stabilized. So it's going to be a relatively bleak future. Having said that, from a broader American economy standpoint, I think it's really important to point out that the American energy industry is very resilient. The technologies that they have invented, especially hydraulic fracturing, enable our producers to bring supply onto the market much quicker than other people around the world. So they can react to global signs that economy is picking up and grab that market share versus our friends or not friends in Russia or in OPEC. And it also means, from a consumer standpoint, that prices are going to remain low. I mean, I don't know, nobody's buying gasoline right now, but if you do check gasoline prices, they're the lowest they've been in 10 years. I mean, I filled up for $1.30 last week, first time I filled up in about 6 weeks. And, then I had to sort of harken back and tell my kids about how I remember paying 99 cents when I was in high school. And they roll their eyes, but now they may very well get to that 99-cent price threshold and be able to tell their kids 20 years from now about that. Quickly moving on to the electricity side, as the economy is shut down, electricity demand has dropped. I mean, obviously we're all home using more electricity, but the biggest consumers of electricity are manufacturers and heavy industrial consumers, and many of them, I won't say most, have been shut down. The drop hasn't been really that big. I mean, we've seen in some parts of the country, it's been as much as 10%. In New England last week, it was about 3% below historical or the average over the last 3 years, which is pretty decent. If you're in the business of selling electrons, you need to sell them, which kind of leads me to the one big issue that a lot of my utility members are concerned about, and that's with 30 plus million people filing unemployment claims. There's a lot of people out there who aren't paying their bills because they don't have income. And when you have electric and gas and water utilities, either voluntarily or voluntarily not disconnecting customers for not paying, or in some cases, the regulator's telling them not to, that's a lot of money that they're not bringing in. And they will ultimately, most states have ways to ensure that they're made whole eventually, working through the state regulators. But there is some concern that as we move into the summer and the economy starts reopening and as normal seasonal demand increases as it gets warmer across the country, that there could be a liquidity issue, meaning they're not taking in as much because people aren't paying their bills. Demand is already down, so their overall revenue is relatively low. And you can only run at that rate so long. Hopefully that doesn't happen, but it's one thing that we're looking at from the federal side. In the overall grand scheme of where things are going, there's the water cooler talk all the time is what the next legislative response vehicle is going to look like. Is it going to have infrastructure? Is it going to have stimulus-like provisions like we saw in the 2009 bill after the last recession? And honestly, right now, nobody knows. The Republicans who in the Senate are becoming increasingly concerned about the size of the debt. Everyone agreed, it was very bipartisan, that we needed to spend massive historical amounts of money in order to stabilize the economy through the CARES Act. But that money has to get paid back at some point. And so the question is what is the next vehicle going to look like? And as you can probably imagine, every industry under the sun, and some of them that aren't under the sun, have their priorities for what they would like to see Congress do vis-a-vis stimulus. The one thing I will tell you in the infrastructure space is that whether it's part of the near-term stimulus response or not, the existing 5-year highway bill that Congress passes every 5 years in order to fund surface transportation around the country, to essentially spend that money that you and I pay every time we fill up our tanks of gas or diesel, that expires at the end of the year. And so Congress does absolutely have to pass a new bill to take over for that one. So something is going to happen by the end of the year. It may very well turn out to be one of those gargantuan sort of stimulus-like bills that approaches $1 trillion. It may not. I mean, Congress may decide in its infinite wisdom that the debt's getting too high and they can't spend that much. So that's kind of where we are right now. I think the one thing to note is that it's very, very fluid, and non-legislative vehicles are kind of the order of the day, because while, like I said, there was historic bipartisanship to pass the CARES Act, anyone who watches cable TV or cable news knows that bipartisanship has gone out the window very quickly. And the possibilities of seeing something like that again are becoming smaller and smaller by the day as we get closer and closer to the general election. So if there are issues, whether they're industry specific or economy specific, we're very much trying to find administrative ways to do them, because that takes away from some of the partisan fights that make it impossible to do legislatively. So Linda, with that, I will turn it back to you.
Linda, I think you're muted.
See, the problem is once you mute yourself, you can't unmute yourself.
Okay, now I'm unmuted. Okay.
Welcome back.
Thank you, Christopher. And our next speaker is Tony. Take it away.
Thank you, Linda, and to the main chamber for sponsoring this very useful webinar. I've learned a lot already, and I'm sure that everyone watching has as well with these expert panelists. I'm here today to do two things. First, I want to thank those of you who are participating electronically for all you've done to make the environment of Maine safer in this very difficult time. I made a handful of phone calls yesterday to clients and asked how they were doing, and they're all manufacturers and they're all pretty large, and I was enormously impressed with the rigor with which you folks are coming up with ways to protect your employees and your businesses from the effects of the virus. It's all in our hands, and I think the success that Maine is showing in comparison to some other places is in part a reflection of your effort, and I want to thank you. It's a great example of what we can do when we have to. My purpose today is to talk a bit about energy and climate issues, because they are relatively similar in Maine and New England right now, and increasingly at the federal level, and how they're affected by this pandemic. And there may not immediately appear to be any connection, but there are some connections in the patterns that we have seen, and I would like to draw attention to those. And to cut to the chase and give you the headline, one of the big concerns that my clients have had, particularly recently, has been the reaction of policymakers to fear itself. That it seemed that, for example, when climate issues came up in the recent Maine legislative process, that reason and science did not play the dominant role they should have, and that some policies were made more based on fear than on facts, and therefore have taken significant risks of unnecessary costs and ineffective expenditures of money. And this, we think, is a risk also in regard to response to the pandemic itself. It's only natural that public officials would do everything they can to mitigate this problem and to move forward with good policies to prevent repetition in the future. The challenge for manufacturers, quite frankly, is not just to make your product anymore. It is to make sure that your people are available through the chamber, through the Industrial Energy Consumer Group, through the U.S. Chamber, in fact, to give expert advice and common sense advice to public officials on a timely basis. Because if we don't, we can be sure they will receive other advice, which, however well-intentioned, may not be the most efficient and effective ways to deal with a public problem. Let me draw some comparisons between the pandemic and energy. First, it's really clear now that we live by global supply chains, and that has enormous benefits in reducing costs. It may even produce products more quickly, but it also carries risks. And among the risks are that those global supply chains do not always have the ability to repair themselves or to do so quickly. And when that happens, obviously, it's sort of like my parents' Christmas tree lights. When one goes out, all the rest of them went out. Now, we have better lights now, but the fact remains the same. The consequence is that one business has a problem that knocks out the next business and knocks out the next, and pretty soon you're worried about as John said, how Mexico is handling the pandemic, affecting how your companies in the United States are hurt by that reaction. These phenomena ignore borders and geography, and the tautness of this supply chains raise risks. And when that risks arises, the next phenomenon we need to worry about is our ability to perceive risks. The gathering of intelligence is a product itself. It is sometimes priceless. And with the global supply chains being so important, the collection of information about, for example, pandemics, is incredibly important to manufacturers being able to be prepared to compensate, to find other sources of supply, and indeed to protect their employees and their business. And if we fail to invest in intelligence gathering, if we fail to act on intelligence when we receive it, if we fail to see that the right people get the intelligence so they can act, we do so at great peril. My third point is that although workers are generally available, for example, with 30 million people unemployed, the availability of trained and specialized workers tends to be located right where the problems arise themselves. That is, when there's a problem in a supply chain, it happens where the workers are in some cases, and it takes time to train new workers when they become ill. And it takes time to deal with the disruptions at a manufacturing facility or another supply point. That time is money, and more importantly, the effects are felt all the way along the series of the chain. Food production is an interesting example as well. Some products are truly global, like white socks and iPhones. They're made in a specific place, and we bear the consequences. Food production is less global, obviously, but it is regional. And as we've learned with the processing of meat, in most developed countries, meat production is centralized. And this food issue is important because certain kinds of disruptions do not produce civil unrest. The loss of food can easily produce civil unrest, disrupting both order and governments themselves. And that brings me to my fourth point. The previous risks I've talked about are risks against which most businesses cannot insure. The cost is simply too high. The risk capital is not available. And most insurance policies write out this kind of risk. However, when a global supply chain disrupts, the insurer of last resort is government all across the globe. And that has some certain consequences as well. I mean, governments provide national defense, they ensure domestic tranquility, and most importantly, they print a lot of money. And that's the issue that Chris just talked about. There are constraints on that. And we are now apparently running up against some of those constraints. But the call to use that power is very strong. And one of the consequences is that when we have a global supply chain that is so taut and that is disrupted, and when governments act, we end up with governments that are more powerful, larger, and more deeply in debt. And that has consequences for dealing with other issues, for example, like climate mitigation. The real issue is, once these things happen and government takes over and makes decisions, who makes the decisions? You've heard that the Chamber is seeking to have decisions made without a need for partisan agreement because it gets things done. That will work to a certain extent. It may not work for transportation legislation. We have found that the greatest risk, we being industrials in Maine, who I work with in the Industrial Energy Consumer Group, we have found that the greatest risk is, once government becomes active, is of a failure to adopt effective and efficient policy proposals. And the analogy here between what's happened in climate policy in Maine and what could happen with a pandemic anywhere, is between climate and fear of consequences of a pandemic. And the two things are somewhat alike. Let me just give you two examples here, and I'll come to my conclusion. The first example is the climate policies in Maine adopted in the legislative session were motivated significantly by well-intentioned people and had some good ideas. Some of them were not good ideas. And when industry objected to those, we were not successful. And the consequence is that we will now have solar projects in Maine, very small, 5 megawatts in size or less, which cost as much as twice or 3 times as much as large solar. So the result is we spend more money than we need to, and we get less supply of solar than we want to mitigate our climate risks. This is a serious problem. A related matter is the need to make existing policies, laws, agencies do what they're supposed to do. If we do that, we will limit the risk of new policies that will be ineffective. We're not doing a great job at having agencies do their job. And a really good example, one that comes into energy and international trade, is the attempt to build a power line between essentially Massachusetts and Quebec to bring in clean hydropower. We're very familiar with this controversy in Maine. We're probably less familiar with the fact that the battle raged over a very similar line for the same purpose in New Hampshire for 3 years before it was finally rejected. It's taken over 70 years, or almost twice the length of World War II, to so far not build that power line to bring clean, renewable hydroelectricity to New England to make sure the lights stay on as the old oil, coal, and nuclear power plants are retired. We need to make our systems work, and it's by and large a significant responsibility of those of us who need the system to stay on, who need the lights to stay on. And that's groups like the Chamber, the U.S. Chamber, and the Industrial Energy Consumer Group. Thank you, Linda. You're still muted.
Okay, now I'm not. Thank you all. I've got a couple questions here to ask that came in. One is, you know, and I talked about this to all of you when we were preparing for this this webinar. U.S. has adopted some policies, specifically in the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, to try to bring manufacturers back to the U.S. by reducing tax rates. Given a lot of what you're seeing now with this pandemic, the energy issues, the trade, do you expect that manufacturers are going to be coming back to the U.S. more so, given the somewhat instability in some of the different countries, or do you expect that they're going to stay where they are? I guess I throw that out to anyone that wants to answer.
So I'll jump in on that. I think it's important, first of all, to, you know, operate from the right fact base. You know, as a very broad framing, I would just say that, you know, U.S. manufacturing has probably, it's doubled output since about 1992. So that's a little more than 25 years. So output in many industries has continued to rise. Unemployment has been in decline since 1979, in fact. And some of that has to do with the fact that the United States manufacturing base is heavier in very capital intensive products like, say, semiconductors, which are not very labor intensive, and much less so in things like apparel than we used to be. Having said that, there is a lot of examination right now, for instance, of the pharmaceutical supply chain. And I mentioned this briefly earlier. There's a variety of bills that have been introduced. There's work within the administration looking at this. There are some pharmaceutical products where I do think we're going to see some changes. For instance, on antibiotics. The United States is very dependent on imports of antibiotics. where there's actually bigger problems too, that a lot of our antibiotics have developed resistance. We need to have a new incentive system to create new antibiotics, because what we have isn't working, and it's all imported anyway. But for many other products, it's just not the case that we're as dependent as the popular narrative has. There's talk about tax breaks. For some of these industries, though, it takes a lot more than tax breaks to make that happen. Building a new pharmaceutical manufacturing facility takes 5 to 8 years. It's extremely expensive. And as I mentioned earlier, U.S. actually already produces about 70% of all our pharmaceuticals. So, I do think we're going to see the issue studied, but it's going to probably have to be targeted on areas where there is a very specific concern about being dependent on imports, rather than a broad blunderbuss approach that is could either be very expensive or not work.
Okay.
Well, and to John's point, one important energy factor to point out is just last week, President Trump issued an executive order that relates to electricity bulk power systems, which is to say the generators who bring who generate and transmit electricity to you and I and to our employers. This was put in place to create a screen to start looking at where these machines and this technology is coming from, because there's great fear that there are already there's fear, but there's no demonstrable proof that there are potential backdoors built into the technologies we have, so that foreign states or bad actors in foreign states could create a disruption in power at will. It wasn't directed exclusively at China, but it's certainly part of the issue. And so I think in some of those areas that relate to kind of national security and economic security, this administration has not been bashful about essentially trying to reshore that type of supply chain. Whether or not it actually happens kind of depends. We have to see how vulnerable these things are. I mean, they're not vulnerable, but maybe they could be less vulnerable further.
Okay, good. Another question I have is, what does this mean? I'm going to throw this out. What does the low oil prices mean for specifically Maine companies, and what should they be looking at or keeping their eye on as we kind of see this continue over the next couple years? What do you think Maine companies ought to be doing right now? Any comments on that?
Yeah, the first thing I would say is I'm not convinced that we're going to have low oil prices over the long haul. If you look at the massive amount of capital expenditures that are not happening as companies are reacting to the prices right now, there's a little bit of a lag time in the oil production kind of flow chain. Acme Oil may make an announcement that they're going to spend $100 million right now on exploration and production. Well, that oil may not hit the market for another year, maybe even 2 or 3 years if you're talking about like offshore production. Well, we're seeing historic levels of declined spends right now across the world. In a relatively short period of time, that's going to catch up, meaning that we're going to go from having way too much oil, which we have right now, which is why the prices are low, to potentially having not enough, especially if the global economies start to flourish again. That I'm not promising that's going to happen, but I don't think that you can assume that we're going to have depressed oil prices in perpetuity. Now, having said that, regardless of whether prices go up or go down, I think right now is a great time to take advantage on the transportation side of things. Transportation fuels are low. Regardless of what I just said, they're going to stay low at least for the next 3 to 6 months. So are there areas of commerce that can be taken advantage of now that perhaps would have been cost prohibitive as little as 3 months ago? And that's especially true on the the manufacturing side of things. I mean, when you say oil and you say gas, most people assume, transportation fuels. But it's also incredibly important, especially at this time, to note how critical these inputs are to our manufacturing sector. I mean, if
Right.
you look just at the COVID response, all the masks, all the gowns, all the PPE that John talked about, as well as the pharmaceuticals, those things are all made out of oil and gas. And so right now, this kind of sort of dovetails with the last question. There's opportunities to take advantage of these historic low prices for these commodities to gain market share on the production of manufactured goods that are made out of these inputs.
Okay. All right. Okay, that's all the questions we have. And I would like to thank all of our speakers today. And again, I'd like to thank our sponsors, premier sponsor, Pretty Flaherty, Central Maine Power, our series sponsor, as well as Bangor Savings Bank, and as well as the Department of Economic and Community Development. Thank you, gentlemen, for your input. It was very valuable. And thank all of our participants for attending this webinar, and look in the future to many other webinars we're planning on having to keep Maine businesses apprised at what's happening during this pandemic. So again, thank you, and we will see you soon.
Thank you.
Thank you.